Hello and thank you for joining us on Newsweek, where we highlight some of the biggest stories that made the headlines recently. I am Jacinta Agochukwu. This week, President Bola Tinubu took decisive action to address the pressing issue of food inflation by declaring a state of emergency, recognizing the urgent need to alleviate the hardship faced by citizens. He ordered the immediate release of fertilizers and grains, aiming to stabilize food prices and ensure adequate supply. Also this week, the House of Representatives approved President Tinubu's request for subsidy palliatives, acknowledging the need for measures to mitigate the economic burden on the Nigerian people. Later on the show, private security intercepts 8,000-liter capacity vessel with stolen crude oil. All the details in a moment. Stay with us. President Bola Tinubu during the week declared a state of emergency on food security as the federal government stepped up efforts to tackle food inflation following the removal of fuel subsidy. Tinubu also approved that all matters pertaining to food and water availability and affordability be included within the preview of the National Security Council. There would also be immediate release of fertilizers and grains to farmers and households to mitigate the effects of the subsidy removal. Also, a commodity board would be created to monitor and control food prices. Special advisor to the President on Special Duties, Communication and Strategy, Dele Alake, disclosed this to a State House correspondent. Alake said the administration intends to deploy some savings from the fuel subsidy removal into the agricultural sector, focusing on revamping the agricultural sector. Alake explained that FG would partner with states to create ranches in those whose government are willing to provide lands. Joining me to discuss this in the studio, I have Ayodele Adio, and he is a policy analyst. And as well, I have Olufemi Lawson, Executive Director, Center for Public Accountability via Zoom, joining me. Good evening, gentlemen. Mr. Ayodele, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Let me begin with you, Mr. Olufemi Lawson. What do you make of this intervention by President Tinubu? Some say it's long overdue, as the food crisis in the country has persisted for a long time.
Thank you for having me. It's a very right step, very timely, especially when you look at the fact that as we speak, not less than 25 million of our population are facing extreme hunger. As we speak, the consequences of last year's, flooding witnessed across the country, which is perhaps the worst in the last 10 years, still lingers. So something very radical has to be done. And I think that is what President Tinubu has done. Unfortunately, Nigerians had expected that this would have been done almost immediately after, last year's flood, which practically, led to the total, calamity on the agricultural sector, over 675, hectares in some communities, in other communities, hectares of land in thousands got swept away by the flood. So the implications are already here. The consequences are already around here. In actual fact, in the last couple of weeks, it has practically become impossible for Nigerians to even go to the market with their own money and get some of these food items for purchase. During the last Salah celebration, people could practically purchase, pepper and tomato, even to cook, even with their money. So the consequences of this demand such radical actions as taken by the president, and I think it's commendable. Not only is it commendable that, of course, a relief will come to the challenges we're currently facing, I think it's also a very fundamental step in our quest as a country to improve and increase agricultural potentials, because this will not only be an encouragement for existing farmers, it will not be an encouragement for people who are already in the business, but this will also be an encouragement for people who are willing to go into the farming business. So It's a radical decision, and I think it's long, overdue.
All right, let me come to you, Mr. Ayodele. You will agree with me that Nigeria is actually blessed with millions of hectares of arable land which have not been optimally utilized. How do you think that food sufficiency can be achieved?
I mean, a lot of work and planning has to go into this. Like your guest has rightfully mentioned, there are key drivers that has worsened the cost of food in our country today. And mind you, you recall that the major instigator of inflation in our country today are the prices of food items, because the average household expends over 65% of its income on food alone, and so when the prices of food goes up, it inadvertently triggers inflation across the country. And if you deal with the prices of food and you bring it down, it would have a positive effect on inflation, which means to drop inflation much lower. But of course, there are challenges, one of which is the flooding that happens across the country. How do we deal with that? And how is that situated in the plan of the president? Of course, another problem is infrastructure. How do we connect places where food are being produced to the markets? That's a critical problem that we have to deal with, which means in the plan there has to be quality spending on infrastructure. Of course, there is the fact of insecurity. A lot of farmers are afraid to go to farmlands in certain places in the country. How do we make farmers feel safer to go to farms? So these are the issues that have to be properly situated in Mr. President's plan if we're going to see any positive impact from what has been carefully articulated. Now, if there is no proper planning, like we saw with many of the policies, especially as driven by the CBN in the last 3 years, and I'm talking about the Anchors Borrowers programs and several other programs, that was in partnership with the CBN and the Ministry of Agriculture that spectacularly failed because there was poor coordination and there was a lack of cohesion between the federal government and what was happening across states. So one of the things that I would like to see is that there is better coordination between the plans and policies of the federal government with the 36 Ministry of Agriculture across the 36 states, because the subnational governments are where land is. You need governors to access land. So if you're planning without these governors, I think those plans will end up in futility. So I would like to see a lot more cohesion, a lot more coordination between the federal government and the state governments, and map out a clear plan, and scrutiny to see that this plan are carefully implemented. And then we may begin to see the benefits of this. But I like the fact that the president has identified that there's a food crisis. And if we don't drop the prices of food and commodities in our country, we'll continue to struggle with inflation. Because for the last 24 months, we have tried to deal with this inflation by raising rates in terms of monetary policy. And we've continued to raise rates, and inflation has continued to go up. So it clearly shows that the problem is not too much money in circulation. The real problem here is the cost of food. And if we don't attack that, inflation will continue to elude us and continue to dwindle our purchasing power across the country.
All right, Mr. Olufemi Lawson, just like Ayodele had mentioned, of course, there are a combination of several factors that had conspired to deprive many homes of food. And he also made some suggestion on how this plan should work out. To you, how do you think this plan by the president can be well implemented?
Well, most importantly, the president must ensure that this is not another, food for the boys. Just like he said, over the past 2 years, we've had a situation whereby this country, gave money in billions of nairas to farmers whose farms only existed in their briefcases and, of course, in their offices in Abuja and some other states across the country, who never planted a seed anywhere in this country. And that is why today, despite all the huge amount of money given out by the CBN in the name of anchor borrower and all sort of funny nomenclatures, there's no single bag of rice that can be shown as a result of such investment in the agricultural sector. Secondly, the president, before releasing these funds that are going to be meant to support this national emergency declaration on food security, must do the needful by ensuring that we prepare the necessary grants for people to be able to return from farm, for investors to be able to come into the agricultural sector. Today, the question of insecurity, in a lot of states today, Plateau, Benue, other states in the Middle Belt, which are the food basket of these nations, farmers can no longer go to farm. In some places, herders also have issues with security of their cattle and herders. Today, as we speak, there are communities that are going to be flooded this year, according to the NIMET prediction. So the federal government must look at these critical issues, address it before moving in the direction of providing the needed resources to address this issue of food security as declared by the state of emergency of food security. Otherwise, this will end up as another palliative for the boys, many of whom will not leave Abuja, but take money in the name of implementing the federal government emergency on food security. So the federal government, most importantly President Bola Tinubu, must define its approach towards ensuring the implementation of this national emergency on food security. We must address the question of insecurity. We must be able to ensure that our farmers are able to go back to the farm. We must ensure that the needed climatic, issues are addressed. The issue of climate change, we cannot overrule it. We cannot talk about food security without talking about the challenges of climate change. So these are fundamental issues that the government must look into before rolling out
Mr.
whatever.
Olufemi, we need to go on break.